Welcome to part 2 of the tutorial on how to make this wood lathe. In last week's tutorial I showed you how to make the base of the lathe from some 50 by 50 square steel tubing. If you haven't seen that tutorial, the link is in the description down below. This week's tutorial is going to be on how to make the headstock, which is obviously the most crucial part of a wood lathe. The central part of the headstock is the M24 stainless steel threaded rod, which I machined down to fit inside bearings. The reason I use this threaded rod is so that I can add different attachments, as I showed in the previous video. At the front of the headstock there's this large thrust bearing which should take all of the force that I apply sideways on objects as I'm turning things. Then inside this sandwich of two pieces of mild steel and some plywood, there's two large motorbike bearings which have a 20mm inside diameter, and they take all of the lateral sideways vibration force. Those two pieces of metal are then welded onto the base, so it's all held really solidly, so there should be no vibration. Then in between the front and the back parts of the headstock I have these cone pulleys, which I've got held on with an M6 set screw. The very back of the headstock, the metal steps down to 10mm diameter and goes through two more ball bearings. It also has two thrust bearings on either side, and I tightened those up against the back part of the headstock, and that should stop the headstock from vibrating either side. These thrust bearings don't actually take much force while the lathe is running. It basically just means that I can tighten the bolts down tight and stop there from being any vibration. I realised that this is quite a complicated design and quite a complex way of making a headstock of a lathe, and this is probably not the simplest way. I designed this almost over a year ago now. But anyway, I went and made it and it works really well and it's completely solid, so if it works then it doesn't really matter. So I drew up the design in CAD and I want to first cut out the plywood bits of the headstock, and then I'm going to use those to trace out onto the metal. I used my X-Carve CNC machine to cut out the plywood bits, and you could also do this by hand with just a jigsaw or just a handsaw or a bandsaw, but a CNC machine is much easier because I don't actually have to do anything, and it makes sure that everything's completely square and exactly the right shape. All of these pieces of wood are cut out of some very high grade 18mm Baltic birch plywood, so they should be really strong. I drilled out the centre holes with Forstner bits so that they almost fit into the bearings. The two bearings that I'm using here are 20mm inside diameter and 10mm inside diameter. I'm making sure that these are sealed for life bearings so that I don't have to give them any maintenance and I don't need to take the lathe apart. I got some 5mm mild steel plate and traced around the plywood pieces that I cut out on the CNC machine. Then used an angle grinder with a thin cut-off wheel to cut out all of the parts. After a bit of filing and grinding, I got all of the metal parts so that they're the exact same shape as the plywood parts. You'll notice that for the front piece of the headstock I'm actually using two pieces of steel, and for the back piece of the headstock I'm only using one. This is because the front piece of the headstock is going to be taking most of the force, so I want two pieces of steel which are welded down to take all of that force. I then had to drill out the centres of these pieces so that they were the right size for the bearings. Unfortunately at this point I didn't have a step drill bit or any drill bits large enough, so I had to drill a series of small circles all around the edges and use files to enlarge it. Would have been much more accurate and much easier if I'd had a larger step drill bit at the time. I actually have one now, but I didn't when I made this. I keep on filing until everything's the right size for the bearings, and I want it to be quite a tight press fit. I then do the exact same thing with the larger front piece of the headstock. So this is what the two pieces of the headstock look like once I've got them all so that the bearings fit inside them. You can see the arrangement that they're going to be in when I weld them down to the base, but first I need to make the headstock rod out of the M24 threaded rod, which is going to run through the centre, to make sure everything's nice and perfectly aligned before I weld it together. So I got this piece of M24 threaded rod off eBay, and it's actually made of A2 stainless steel, so it should be really strong. First I had to find the centre of it for my lathe. It was too long to fit actually inside the headstock of my metal lathe, so I had to drill the centre out by hand. I'm going to be turning the metal on this small South Bend lathe that I've got, and it's a really great lathe for metal turning, although it's not the most accurate, but it should be great for this project. If you don't have a metal lathe, then you can always borrow someone else's or go to a machine shop and borrow one for a bit. This isn't a very complicated turning project at all. The threaded rod was a little bit long, so I chopped it off. I then started turning the threaded rod down to a 20mm outside diameter. Unfortunately, because I had to hand drill the live centre in the other side, it wasn't completely on centre, but the side that was being held in by the chuck, which is the side that's actually going to have all of the attachments on, was still completely on centre, so it didn't matter in the end. I turned this section at the end down to a 10mm outside diameter so that it would fit perfectly into the 10mm bearings. I then turned the rest of the threaded rod until close to the end down to a 20mm outside diameter so that it would fit into the larger 20mm bearings. Once that's done, the bearings fit on the shaft pretty well, and it's maybe a little bit loose, but there's not much play in it. I can then assemble everything onto the shaft in the order that it needed to be going onto the lathe, and that started with the big thrust bearing at the front, the two 20mm bearings and the front piece of the headstock, then the two 10mm bearings and some small thrust bearings at the back, and the back piece of the headstock. You can see that these pieces spin with really low friction, but there's actually no wobble in the structure itself. I chopped off a piece of large steel rod and machined it down to a 20mm inside diameter, so that then it would make a spacer for the two 20mm bearings. This keeps the two 20mm bearings spaced the right amount apart inside the headstock. I then need to make some covers which are going to clamp the bearings in place, and I'm going to do that out of some mild steel discs that I've got. These pieces have to bolt through the two pieces of the headstock, so I drill 2 holes in either side of them, then drill 2 holes corresponding in the headstock so that they'll fit. Some M6 bolts secure everything and make sure that it's not going to go anywhere. Even only being held by the back piece of the headstock, there's only a little bit of play. I mark how far the 10mm section of the headstock sticks out the back of the lathe. I then tap this to an M10 thread so that I can bolt everything together. By the time that I had to make the front bearing covers, I'd actually bought a step drill, and this was much easier to drill the larger holes. I didn't have to drill a series of holes around a 20mm inside diameter. This is what it looks like once I've got all of the bolts tightened up and all of the bearings are in place. Everything spins really smoothly, but then there's barely any play in the metal, and it's actually really cool to feel. I drill a couple of holes through the metal plates of the headstock and put some M6 bolts through them to tighten everything down, sandwich all of the layers together to make sure that it's all working as one piece to keep it nice and strong. Then use an angle grinder to create a chamfer on the edges of the metal. These are going to be weld chamfers, so it's a place for me to lay down weld beads. From some 6mm mild steel sheet, I cut a base plate which I'm going to weld the headstock onto. I then drilled a centre hole in it. I got everything positioned nice and square and then tack welded it all in place. I then undid all of the bolts, took out the bearings and slid out the piece of plywood in the middle so that when I weld it up, it doesn't burn. Then used my arc welder to weld all of the pieces straight down onto the piece of mild steel base. Once that's done, I slide the plywood back into place and I can put the bolts back on. Before welding on the back piece of the headstock onto the steel plate, and make sure that the actual rod is fitting into the bearings and that it can spin freely once it's inside. Then I weld it in place, and because the rod's in place, it will make sure to hold it in the correct position the entire time. Once that's done, I can then clamp it down to the base and it feels really solid. I then drilled and tapped an M6 hole in the base of the lathe, which I'm then going to be using as one of the attachment points for the headstock, so I can bolt it on. I thread an M8 bolt through that centre hole that I drilled ages ago, through the centre of the base of the lathe, and then I thread the M6 bolt into the hole that I just tapped, and that seems to hold it on really securely. So that's where I'm going to end this part of the tutorial today, and the headstock is pretty much complete. The next part of the tutorial is going to be on making the cone pulleys and attaching on the motor. So thanks for watching. If you want any updates on this project as I'm building it, then follow me on Instagram, the link is in the description down below. And if you want early access to any of these videos, all of the videos that I post actually, then consider supporting me on Patreon.